Welcome back, people of Hope Lutheran Church, to our series of lectures on biblical history. This is the second lecture in a series where we're going to take a look at the main characters in biblical history, starting with Abraham, and we are going to go all the way through to the early church. The last lecture, I talked about the different ways of approaching biblical study. Archaeology and the findings of archaeology have helped us to understand the Bible and the history of Israel much better than we have in the past. And the other major approach has been textual analysis, and I want to talk a little bit about that today because textual analysis has played a very important role in terms of our understanding of the Bible and how it came into being in its present form. Now, this particular lecture you've already received in written form, but I want to go through it in lecture form as well because it's very important that we understand this aspect of approaching biblical study. First, I'm going to give you 4 passages to look up in order to answer the following 2 questions. And again, this is on the written lecture. Question number 1, excuse me. When were human beings created? Were they created first or were they created last, according to the biblical text? Secondly, how many species of animals was Noah told to place on the ark before the flood? The passages to look up in order to answer these questions are first, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 27. Second passage, Genesis chapter 2, verses 4b to 7. Third passage, Genesis chapter 6, verses 19 to 20. Fourth passage, Genesis 7, verses 2 to 3. Now, if you found 2 different answers to each question, you have looked up the right passages. Human beings were created after everything else, according to the first passage. They were created before everything else, according to the second passage. Regarding Noah, in the first passage, he is told to gather 2 of each species, 1 male and 1 female, for obvious reasons. In the second passage, Noah is told to gather 7 pairs of all clean animals and 2 of the unclean variety. Also, 7 pairs of birds need to be included. So, as you can see, there are 2 answers to the questions, and the question then becomes, what is the reason that we have 2 different answers to the same questions in the biblical text? And that's the question I want to briefly answer in this particular lecture, because it has to do with textual analysis and what scholars have found through the years as they have looked in great detail at, now you need to be able to read in the original Hebrew to really see what's going on here. What they have found over the years by scouring through the text in the original Hebrew is really quite fascinating. In order to answer the question, I want to go back. We're going to do a little history first. And I want to go all the way back to the reign of Solomon. Solomon, you might remember, was the last of the kings who reigned over the united monarchy. There was King Saul first, then King David, then his son Solomon. Solomon's reign was noted as a reign of great prosperity, wealth, peace. It was the golden age in the history of Israel. And Solomon himself was noted as a very wise king. But in some ways, Solomon was not particularly wise. One of the things Solomon was noted for was his building projects, the most famous of which, of course, was the temple. Solomon built the first temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And the question is, how did Solomon find the labor to build these various impressive monuments and temples and palaces and whatever else it was he built? And the answer to the question is that he used impressed labor. He forced the young men from the northern tribes to spend a period of time working on these various projects. And this was not a choice on their part. This was something that they were forced to do, and didn't particularly appreciate it, frankly. So when Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam ascends to the throne, the 10 northern tribes from whom Solomon derived this impressed labor, they give King Rehoboam an ultimatum. They tell him, look, we will continue to recognize the line of David as the legitimate king over a united kingdom here, over all 12 tribes, so long as you cease and desist these policies that your father had stupidly put into place, where he was treating the northern tribes unfairly, as opposed to the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Unfortunately, Rehoboam was not noted as a diplomat. In fact, that was not one of his skill sets. So he turns around, and instead of doing what his advisors suggested, and that is to make peace with the northern tribes and lessen the burden that his father Solomon had put on them, he said, I'm going to make the burden even worse. I'm going to do even more than my father Solomon did. King Rehoboam apparently had an ego problem. He wanted to throw his weight around, and he wasn't going to have any of these northern upstarts tell him how to run his kingdom. So, well, as a result, the elders of the northern tribes decided that they were going to secede from this union. They would no longer recognize the line of David as the place from which the kings would come, and they would establish their own kingdom. And I think in order to just sort of stick it to the southern tribes, they chose the name of Israel as the name of their kingdom. And as a king, they chose one of Solomon's disloyal generals, a man named Jeroboam, who had returned back from Egypt. And now we have two kingdoms. We have the kingdom of Judah to the south, which continues to recognize the line of David and for whom Jerusalem continues to be the capital, and for whom the temple that Solomon built continues to be the center of worship and sacrifice in the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, on the other hand, establishes a capital first in a place called Shechem, which I believe was the place where Joshua had first gathered the 12 tribes after the conquest in order to get all of them to agree to form a union based on the covenant that God made with them through Moses. And later that capital was moved to a place called Samaria under, I believe, King Omri. In any case, they also established 2 new worship sites. One was established in Bethel, which was the place where Jacob had his dream of a ladder to heaven as he was running away from his brother Esau, who wanted to kill him. And the other was in the northern part of Galilee, in the area where the tribe of Dan had eventually located. There were 2 worship sites built there, both of which had a golden calf symbolizing the high god El. This was inherited from Canaanite religion, although I believe that many in the northern kingdom associated the high god El also with the God of Israel. So we have now 2 kingdoms with their own capitals, their own worship sites, and that is going to remain the case for the rest of the story of the history of ancient Israel. Now, what this results in, obviously, is that these 2 kingdoms are going to keep separate records. Okay, so the southern kingdom is going to keep its own records of etshistory. The northern kingdom is going to keep its records of its history. And eventually, when the children of Israel are exiled by the Babylonians, and these different documents are brought with them into exile. This, of course, is a theory, but this is the theory I think most people accept. It was at the time of the exile, while they were in Babylon, in order to maintain their identity as a people. They combined the documents that were brought from the north together with the documents that were brought from the south, and also included in this were documents that originated with the priestly class and the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy has its own interesting history. Most people think that this was the book that was discovered in the 7th century BC when King Josiah asked the high priest to clean out the temple. And he found a book, and he brought it to King Josiah. And King Josiah had the book read publicly and realized at that point that the religious life of Judah was completely in contradiction to what Moses had told the people as they were about to enter the Promised Land. So Josiah was a kind of a Martin Luther of ancient Israel. That is to say, he became a reform king, and he instituted many reforms in the southern kingdom during his reign. Unfortunately, King Josiah met an unfortunate end. He was killed during a battle with the Egyptian army near the city of Megiddo. And pretty much it was all downhill for Judah after the death of King Josiah. In any case, so we've got the following documents. We've got the northern document, which is referred to as E because of the name they use for God starts with the word E. The southern document is referred to as J because that in German is the first letter of the word Yahweh, which is the word used for God in the southern kingdom. Then you've got the document that is named P because it came from the priestly class. And then you've got the book of Deuteronomy. So if you were to look at the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, as a whole, as we have it now, it would represent a combination of all 4 of those documents. They were all put together into one document, most people believe at the time of the Babylonian exile, a time when the people needed to maintain their identity as a separate people. The northern tribes, of course, had been exiled by the Assyrians way back in 721 BC, and they were lost to history, apparently assimilating with whatever populations they were resettled with. The southern kingdom did not want that. The people of Judah did not want that to happen with them. So they maintained their identity, and one of the ways in which they did that was to hold on to their traditions. And to do that, they combined all 4 of those sources that I mentioned. And so when you read the Torah in the original Hebrew, what you find is not just differing details, such as the ones I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, where you have different numbers of animals on the ark, or different chronology of when human beings were created, but you have also different names used for God, and different diction, different ways of writing. So you can sort of tell from the Hebrew text that what we have here is a combination of documents. In terms of textual study of the Bible, that is an example of what we're talking about. The only other thing I want to mention in that connection, because that's going to come up again and again as well, and that is that the book of Deuteronomy served as a kind of interpretive key for the folks who interpreted the history of Israel. So you're gonna notice when we get to, for example, the book of Judges, there is a pattern that is always noted in the history of each of the judges. The pattern is that the people sin in some way, engage in idolatry, or in some way disobedience. God gives them up to their enemies, as God warned them he would do through Moses. And after that, the people cry out to God for help. And God responds by raising up what was called a judge, a charismatic leader. The judge or the charismatic leader is able to put together a force of people from various tribes, and they together fight back against the enemies of Israel. They prevail. There is a time of peace and prosperity, and then the people once again fall into sin, and the same pattern repeats itself over and over again. This is called the Deuteronomistic history because it follows what Moses said in the book of Deuteronomy was going to happen if the people disobeyed. Disobey, God will give you up to your enemies. Obey, and God will watch over you. You will prosper, and you will do just fine. Okay, so with that behind us, we're going to move on now. In the little bit of time we have left, we're going to start the history of Israel with its beginning, and its beginning is, of course, Abraham. Genesis, as I pointed out, is broken up into two sections. There's Genesis chapters 1 to 11, which is primeval history, history before recorded history, the stories of creation through the story of the Tower of Babel. And then in Genesis chapter 12, we begin the story of salvation, the theme of the entire Bible, with the call of Abraham. Abraham, of course, at first, his name is Abram, A-B-R-A-M, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to call him Abraham throughout. He actually becomes Abraham only after a covenant is formed between him and God. But in any case, this would have been, there is no source of information about Abraham or any of the patriarchs outside of the Bible. There is no written sources that refer to any of them any place, either from Egypt or the north in Mesopotamia. And by the way, this entire history takes place within the confines of what was called the Fertile Crescent. This was the kind of the cradle of civilization because it consisted of the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. This was an area that was well watered. The soil was rich, so it could easily be farmed. And the land was good also for people who raised livestock. In fact, there were often conflicts between the settled farmers and the pastoralists, they were sometimes called, the people who raised livestock and who would move from place to place looking for new pasture for their livestock. Obviously, there were times when the two came into conflict with one another over the use of land. Probably the story of Cain and Abel reflects that to some degree. But in any case, there is no, like I was saying, there is no reference to the patriarchs outside of the Bible. Most people date this to around the year 2000 BC, probably a little bit after that. There is evidence that at the time there was a drought in the region, so there was a lot of movement of populations at the time. It's also the case that there were patriarchal families. Okay, these were groups of people where there was a patriarch at the head of the family, and then the patriarch's wife or wives, could have been more than one, their children, their servants, their slaves, sometimes extended family, and then, of course, the livestock. And these patriarchal families would wander from place to place looking for pasture. In any case, the story begins with Abraham receiving a call from God in a place called Haran. His father, Terah, is originally from a place called Ur of the Chaldees, which is in Mesopotamia. Haran is as well, but it's in the far northern part, what is now part of Turkey. And when Abraham's father dies, Abraham receives this call from God. And he receives a threefold promise. Abraham, I will give you many descendants, make of you a great nation. I will give you land upon which this nation will exist, and through you all the peoples of the earth shall be blessed. This is the promise God gives Abraham. It is an unconditional promise. God doesn't say, I'll give you this promise only if you do X, Y, or Z. So it's not a conditional promise. It's an unconditional promise. God simply chooses Abraham. Why does God choose Abraham? Who knows? Nobody knows why God chooses Abraham. In the Bible, God is known by how God reveals himself or herself. God is not known in any other way except insofar as God reveals who God is. And God reveals who God is at the outset by calling Abraham and giving Abraham this promise. But Abraham is told that in order to bring this promise into being, he's going to have to leave his home and go to the place that God will show him. That, of course, is going to end up being what was then called ancient Canaan. Canaan is the area that later the Romans referred to as Palestine. That word ultimately came from the Philistines who had settled on the coastal part of that land. It's between Egypt to the south, Mesopotamia to the north. So it was important strategically. It was also important as a place through which the trade routes ran. There was a lot of trade between north and south, and there was a major trade route that went through Canaan called the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea. It was important for a number of reasons, but it was not a united land. It was a land that consisted of city-states. So there were cities that were independent states, and there were several of them that existed at the time when Abraham got there. We are now at a half an hour, so I'm going to stop the lecture at this point. Next time, we are going to begin with the story of what happens to Abraham after he gets to the Promised Land. This is the theme. The theme is one of how a person develops faith in God. How do you live by faith in God's promises? The story of the Bible is the story of a God who gives promises and of a people called to have faith in those promises and to live by, to make choices according to that are consistent with those promises. And so that is the story we're going to follow as we follow the story of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, and of Joseph, which is the period of the patriarchs, and will take us through the book of Genesis. Okay, thank you for listening. Bye for now.